afternoon, everybody. My name is Mark Walsh, and I'm the formation leader of the Sisters of Our Lady of Zion in the Australia region. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon to our presentation on the biblical prophets from Jewish and Christian perspectives by Dr. Natalie Mylonas. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from Bunurong country and acknowledge that this land was never ceded and that the first peoples of this country have a deep spiritual connection to land, water, and air. And I reflect on the importance of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which I think in itself is somewhat of a prophetic document that offers us new ways of looking at the world that we share and how we might do that more equitably. So, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Natalie F. Mylonas, who is a Postdoctoral Research Fellow at Macquarie University, the founder of Learn Ancient Hebrew Online Education, and a seasonal academic at Australia Catholic University in the Faculty of Theology and Philosophy. She's currently writing a volume entitled Jerusalem as Contested Space in Ezekiel, Exilic Encounters with Emotion. And that's through the Library of the Hebrew Bible Old Testament Studies, Bloomsbury, and is forthcoming. Natalie's research interests include the history of emotions, ethnicity, gender and sexuality, biblical poetry, rabbinic Judaism, and early Christianity and world mythologies. So without any further ado, I will take the spotlight away from me and hand you over to Natalie.
Thanks, Mark. Hi, everyone. Today, we're going to be discussing traditions, wisdom, and knowledge from the Mediterranean and the ancient Near East. But I also want to begin by affirming and acknowledging the traditions, the wisdom, and the knowledge that have arisen on country. And for us to just stop for a moment and consider the place that we find ourselves in today. I want to acknowledge the traditional guardians, the ancestors and the caretakers of country where I am, which is the Gadigal clan of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to both the ancestors of this place and any Indigenous peoples here today. I'm really excited to be here. Bringing Jewish and Christian perspectives into dialogue is something that's very close to my heart, and it brings me much joy. And one of the reasons that I find conversations like this to be so valuable is that they have the potential to foster tolerance, yes, of course. But what really excites me is when these conversations take us beyond mere tolerance and enable us to gain a true appreciation for both the similarities between traditions, but more importantly, I think, to celebrate the uniqueness of each tradition and the richness of the diverse perspectives that arise in both Judaism and Christianity as distinct faith traditions. Recording in progress. And we are so fortunate in our current context and times to be able to have these conversations openly and without fear of danger to our lives, because this has not always been the case historically. I just want to acknowledge that. And also we get to do it from the comfort of our homes, which is extra special. So today I'm talking about the biblical prophets from Jewish and Christian perspectives. We're not going to cover all the prophets today, obviously it's a huge topic, but we're going to have almost like a speed dating situation with a few of them where we get to know them a little bit better and then move on. And I've used a very scientific method of determining which prophets we're going to look at, and that is, which ones do I find the most intriguing? So we're going to get to know Miriam, Anna, Elijah, and of course, the best prophet of them all, Ezekiel. We're also going to look at some foundational questions in scholarship around prophecy in Judaism and Christianity. But I want to start with a basic question, which we'll find out in a minute isn't so basic to answer. Who were the prophets? So if I ask you to clear your mind right now and think of the prophets of the Bible, who are the first people who come to mind? Just take a moment and have a think. Now, I'm not a mind reader yet, But I can guarantee you that many of you will have thought of the major prophets, right? The people like Ezekiel, Isaiah, Jeremiah. And these were certainly prophets, but there are two reasons why I want to expand our horizons when we're thinking about prophecy at the very outset of this talk. The first is that Ezekiel, Isaiah, and Jeremiah, they all have one thing in common. They are men. But both Christian and Jewish tradition affirms that there were also female prophets. And I think some of the most evocative and intriguing prophets of Tanakh and the New Testament are women. I'm going to have a look at some of these women today, in particular the prophetess Miriam and also the prophetess Anna. Yeah, slide, please. You might need to click it a few times. Yeah, great. So in Talmud Megillah 14a, the rabbis list 48 male prophets and 7 female prophets. And the quote's on the screen if you want to have a look at it. What's interesting about this list is that the rabbis include females who are not named as prophets in Tanakh or the Hebrew Bible. So the named prophetesses include Miriam, Deborah, and Huldah. But the rabbis add to this list Sarah, Hannah, Abigail, and Esther, which is fascinating. Now, obviously, there are more men than women on the rabbis' list of prophets. And for me, this raises the question of why. And I think that this question can be answered by considering the historical context of many biblical texts and the gender roles that were ingrained in the societies that formed these texts. In other words, in many instances, the male voice is imbued with more authority compared to the female voice. If this issue of gender and prophecy in the biblical texts and their later interpretations interests you, I've listed an article in a resource document that'll go around to all of you by Sikans that addresses rabbinic portrayals of Miriam. And in that article, she goes into some historical context of gender roles during the times of the rabbis. So that's one thing. The second reason I want to broaden our view of prophets is that both Jewish and Christian tradition believe that the prophets of the Bible are not the only prophets, right? There are prophets outside the Bible. Slide, please. Yeah, you might need to click it twice. It's got, I shouldn't have done it like that, but yeah, thank you. So the Talmud states that many of the prophets arose for the Jewish people, and they doubled the number of Israelites who left Egypt. However, only a portion of the prophecies were recorded because only prophecies that were needed for future generations were written down. So that's a lot of people. That's numbering hundreds of thousands of prophets. There's this famous statement in Talmud that says that the spirit of prophecy departed with the death of the prophets Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. But Rabbi Yehuda Shurpin notes that despite this declaration, later sages suggest that if we understand this quote to mean that the spirit of prophecy departed temporarily, then it makes sense of the fact that there were many later sages who were labeled as prophets. So these were Jewish sages from the medieval times as well. So in this way, we can hold these two views of prophecy in the Jewish tradition simultaneously. The New Testament also suggests that prophecy is a gift that continues to be bestowed upon believers of God. So, for example, in 1 Corinthians 12, Paul lists prophecy as one of the gifts of the Spirit, alongside faith, healing, miraculous powers, distinguishing between spirits, and speaking in tongues. So if we can have the next slide. In Acts 2, there's a famous scene when the Holy Spirit descends on the people and they begin speaking in tongues. And Peter seems to understand this event as a fulfillment of the words of the prophet Joel, who says that in the last days, God's going to pour his spirit on the people and your sons and daughters will prophesy. And then it goes on to elaborate on that. There are a few things I find really interesting about this passage. The first is that Peter's making this connection between prophecy and speaking in tongues, which is fascinating to me because Paul lists these as two different gifts of the Spirit. Second, this scene of Pentecost has much in common with scenes from Tanakh, which describe encounters that prophets have with God. Next slide. So there's this multi-sensory description. I'm not going to read the slide, you're welcome to, but there's this multi-sensory description of an encounter with God's Spirit that evokes sound, so like the blowing of violent wind. It evokes vision, so people are seeing what seem to be tongues of fire. And just like in encounters that the prophets have with Spirit in Tanakh, it communicates this in figurative language. So it's using similes, like the blowing of the wind, like tongues of fire. In other words, words are not sufficient to convey, or simple words are not sufficient to convey this encounter. And we're going to see a similar imagery being used in the divine visions that Ezekiel gets, which we're going to get to at the end of this talk. But before we get into the meat of the prophets, we're going to start by considering the different placement of prophetic literature in Tanakh versus Old Testament. And I apologize in advance because this is quite dry. Thanks, Mark. But it's important to understand these differences because this has theological ramifications for how the prophets are understood in Judaism and Christianity. So as many of you will know, the Tanakh is divided up into Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, the Nevi'im, who are the prophets, and the Ketuvim, which is writings in Hebrew. And that's where we get the name Tanakh, right? You'll notice that the prophets make up a whole portion of Tanakh. And if you look really carefully at that list of prophets, you'll notice that there's someone there missing that's considered a prophet in Christian tradition, but not in the Jewish tradition. And that person is Daniel. Why isn't Daniel included or considered to be a prophet in Jewish tradition? Well, the answer to this question varies. So Talmud Megillah 3a states that Daniel wasn't a prophet even though he saw visions, but it doesn't tell us why. And so this leaves a gap that later sages in medieval times take and debate over why Daniel was or wasn't a prophet. But the important thing for today is that Daniel's included in the writings in the Ketuvim section of Tanakh. If we break this placement of the prophets down further, we have the former prophets, the Nevi'im, Hanevi'im Harishonim, and the latter prophets, Hanevi'im Ha'achronim. The former prophets are included in the Deuteronomic history. So this is the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And amongst the latter prophets, you'll see we just have the 12 written there. These are the shorter prophets, which appear in one long scroll or book. Bava Batra 14b goes into quite some depth about why this order is the way it is. And I've included a longer quote from this passage from Talmud in the resources document for you all. You'll notice that after the 12 comes the writings, and the very last book of Tanakh is Chronicles, which is all about the history of Israel and emphasizes the importance of adherence to the law or Torah and being obedient to God. Next slide. If we turn now to the Christian Old Testament, particularly the Catholic canon, you'll see that firstly, there's a lot more books, and secondly, the prophets are all grouped together, along with Lamentations, which tradition ascribes to Jeremiah, and then the canon finishes with Micah. In other words, in the Catholic Old Testament, we're looking forward to restoration and ending with a message of hope. And obviously Matthew 2 verses 5 to 6 interpret Micah 5, 2 and 4 to be a prophecy about Jesus' birth. So very different emphasis in both canons. Let's backtrack for a moment and briefly consider what is a prophet? What are some of the features of the genre of prophecy? One of the most common understandings of what a prophet does is that they predict the future, right? But while this is certainly one of the things a prophet does. I want to put it to you that prophecy goes well beyond prediction of the future. Prophets also explain the past. They enact God's messages with their bodies. This is almost like performance theater. And Ezekiel has many wonderful examples of this if you want to have a look. And the prophets lay out a set of behavioral expectations that God has of his people. And the most important thing, the reason that they can do all these things is because they have direct revelation from God and a direct encounter with God in a way that surpasses the regular person's experience. Next slide. So, for example, Moses, who's the ultimate prophet of Tanakh, and also a person unique among the prophets, was able to stand in God's presence and see God's actual form without being totally destroyed. Remember, Moses tells the Israelites to wait at the bottom of Mount Sinai and warns them in Exodus 19 that if they ascend and encounter God, then they will die. So I think first and foremost, prophets are defined by their special relationship with God, and then by their words and what they share with their communities. If we move to briefly consider genre now, prophetic literature includes various genres within the overarching genre of prophecy. And this gets quite complex, so I just want to do a basic overview. So these other genres include narrative, poetry, and proverbs. And I'm going to come back to poetry and figurative language at the end of this talk, because these feature quite heavily in prophecy. I was looking at Isaiah, the suffering servant, with my students yesterday, and we read through Isaiah 53, and everyone in the class looked very confused at the end. I said, okay, what's this talking about? And everyone said, I have no idea, the language is so complex. So it's figurative language, right? We've got to really get into it to understand it. Next slide, please. So there are a few different types of prophecy. Floyd lists the following. So there's prophecy of salvation. This is good news of coming deliverance. So this is what we want to hear. There's prophetic complaint, which is a plea for deliverance to God. There's prophetic exhortation, which is when a prophet's trying to convince the audience to think or act in a particular way. There's prophetic vision reports, which is quite self-explanatory, when prophets have a vision and they share what they saw or experienced. There's report of oracular inquiry, which is attempt to seek a divine revelation, so on behalf of someone else or for oneself. This can be by a prophet, a priest, or someone else. And a report of prophetic symbolic action. So these are things like the sign acts of Ezekiel, when God asks Ezekiel to enact with his body the message rather than with words. So Ezekiel doesn't mourn his wife, for example, because God tells him that when she dies, he's not to mourn her. So these are really powerful symbolic acts. So let's move to historical context now for a moment, because I'm a historian, and one of the things that I think it's really important to foreground when looking at the prophets of Tanakh and Old Testament is that these prophets were first and foremost addressing specific communities and specific contexts which were during their times or contemporary to their times. And so for me, the place I start when teaching these texts and trying to understand these properties is to first investigate that context with my students and consider the prophecies within that historical context. Now, obviously, the prophets and their prophecies have a life beyond their immediate context. In the case of Christianity, the New Testament obviously understands many of the prophecies to be relating to its time, and often has this eschatological view of many prophecies that suggest that they point to Jesus as the promised Messiah. But it's important to acknowledge that these prophecies were delivered to a specific audience, or in many cases, specific audiences in specific times and contexts, and that we need to understand these contexts first in order to understand the prophets. Next slide. So take, for example, the prophet Ezekiel. Of all the prophets, Ezekiel has been labeled as one of the most disturbing. There are extremely graphic themes and images in his book, and I'm thinking especially now of the portrayal of Jerusalem, the city, as God's unfaithful wife in chapters 16 and 23, which has incredibly sexually graphic and violent themes. But in order to understand these disturbing themes, we need to understand that Ezekiel was a prophet who was displaced. When the Babylonians invaded Jerusalem in 597 BCE, Ezekiel, along with many other Judahites, lost his home, he lost his status, he lost his security, he was emasculated, humiliated, and was finally exiled to a foreign and unfamiliar land. And scholars have been arguing for a few decades now that this displacement caused severe trauma and emotional upheaval, which is palpable in these graphic scenes and disturbing imagery and turbulent emotions that persist right through the book that bears Ezekiel's name. And I've written all about this connection between displacement, trauma, emotion, and space, and in particular, the ways that these themes relate to gender and sexuality in Ezekiel in my latest book, which is coming out in June, called Jerusalem as Contested Space in Ezekiel, if you're interested to read more about that. In addition to their original context, the prophets and their prophecies also have a life after Tanakh in both Jewish and Christian tradition, and a very rich one at that. Texts like the Talmud and the Midrash have their own interpretations and traditions about these prophets and their prophecies. For example, one of the most popular prophetesses to be written about in rabbinic literature is Miriam, the sister of Moses. And I will say that these portraits are not always favorable. Next slide. So if we consider Miriam purely from the Old Testament perspective, she's first mentioned by name in Exodus 15:12, and then she appears again in Numbers, in 1 Chronicles, Deuteronomy, and Micah, or she's mentioned in these texts. But what's interesting is that we only hear her direct speech in 2 verses, in Exodus 15:21 and Numbers 12 verse 2. This interests me because my question then becomes, well, what did she prophesy? If she's a prophet, how can she be represented without speech? And I'm on the same page as the rabbis here, because in the Talmud, this question of, well, what did Miriam prophesy, is answered with the following story, which is on the screen, that tells us some more information about Miriam that we don't find in Tanakh. So the Talmud starts by quoting the relevant verse, and Miriam, the prophetess, the sister of Aaron, took blah, 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 blah. And then it goes on to say what the problem is that they need to interpret. So they're saying, why is Miriam being called the sister of Aaron instead of the sister of Moses? And then we have the interpretations. So Rabbi Amram said, in the name of Rab, and according to others, it was Rabbi Nachman who said, in the name of Rab, it teaches that while she prophesied, or that she prophesied while she was yet the sister of Aaron only, and said, my mother will bear a son who will be the savior of Israel. When Moses was born, the whole house was filled with light, and her father arose and kissed her upon her head, saying, my daughter, thy prophecy has been fulfilled. But when they cast Moses into the river, her father arose and smacked her upon the head, saying, where now is your prophecy? And the Talmud says that is why it's written, and his sister stood afar to know what should be done to him, what would be the fate of her prophecy. So this passage from Talmud is giving us a picture of Miriam prophesying even as a young girl, while also answering the question of A, what did she prophesy? Well, according to this passage, she prophesied the birth of Moses. And B, why did she stand afar to see what happens to Moses when she places him in the river as a baby? Because the biblical text doesn't tell us this. So this passage says that she did so to find out if her prophecy was right. Next slide, please. An interesting counterpart to Miriam in the New Testament is found in the prophetess Anna, who's described in Luke 2. And I call her a counterpart here because we see similar patterns in Anna's portrayal. The passage that we're going to look at actually has two people who prophesy. One is male and one female. Now, there was a man in Jerusalem called Simeon who was righteous and devout. He was waiting for the consolation of Israel, and the Holy Spirit was upon him. It had been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit that he would not die before he'd seen the Lord's Messiah. Moved by Spirit, he went into the temple courts. When the parents brought in the child Jesus to do for him what the custom of the law required, Simeon took him in his arms and praised God, saying, "Sovereign Lord, as you have promised." And then he goes on, right? It's got a big bit of direct speech. And then the bit of Simeon finishes, and the red is the bit that I'm interested in, which is the bit about Anna. There was also a prophet Anna, the daughter of Penuel of the tribe of Asher. She was very old. She lived with her husband 7 years after her marriage, and then she was a widow until she was 84. She never left the temple, but worshipped night and day, fasting and praying. Coming up to them, Jesus' parents, at that very moment, she gave thanks to God and spoke about the child to all who were looking forward to the redemption of Jerusalem. So Anna is characterized in this passage as an old wise woman. She's almost like an old wise crone, and she's fully dedicated her life to the temple because her husband has died. She approaches Mary and Joseph and speaks to them about Jesus. But what is really striking to me about this passage is that we aren't told what she says. We're given vague outline, but we're not given her direct speech. And this is particularly striking when in the very same passage, we have a male who's been given, four lines worth of prophecy. And he isn't even identified as a prophet, which is quite interesting. There are so many questions that are left unanswered here. Why has the author of Luke included a female prophet at all? If we consider this passage in light of the portrayal of women in Luke generally, scholars have drawn attention to the fact that women rarely speak in Luke. There may be more women in Luke than any other gospel, but they're not given a voice necessarily. Now, the exception to this is obviously Mary, who sings her beautiful praise prayer at the very beginning of Luke, in Luke 1:46-55. But generally, women are silent in Luke, and I've included a resource about this in the document if you want to look further into that. So we've discussed some examples of prophets in the Tanakh and the New Testament. What I want to do now is turn to the life that some of these prophets take on in Judaism beyond the Tanakh. We find that some of these prophets live on in very tangible ways in Jewish ritual practice and as beings who appear at later times to certain sages to teach them important lessons. Indeed, it seems almost as though for some of these prophets that their career really kicks off once Tanakh ends. And the classic example of this is Elijah or Eliyahu, who is quite literally invited every Passover to have a drink. He's poured a special glass of wine during the Pesach Seder or the Passover service that's left for him to drink. He's also offered a chair at circumcision ceremonies because he's thought to be the angel of the covenant, a kind of guardian angel for male children when they're circumcised. Next slide, please. Elijah also has a special role of disguising himself when he encounters later generations in order to reveal an important moral lesson or to perform some kind of miracle. And this is both in the Talmud and in some contemporary Jewish communities today. So one of my former teachers from Hebrew University in Jerusalem, Dr. Rabbi Eliezer Shaw, has written a book about these appearances, if you're interested, called Meeting Elijah, True Tales of Eliyahu Hanavi. But let me give you an example of a passage from the Talmud of one of these cases. So it says, our rabbis taught, Rabbi Eliezer, son of Rabbi Shimon, was returning from the house of his teacher. And he was feeling very full of himself, proud of all the Torah that he'd learned. As he journeyed, so fully enjoying his own company, he chanced upon a traveler, Elijah the prophet, whom he thought to be exceedingly ugly. In response to the traveler's respectful greeting, Rabbi Eliezer responded, "Worthless one, how ugly you are. Are all your fellow citizens as ugly as you are?" "I do not know," said the traveler. "Why don't you go and take it up with the master craftsman who made me? Tell him how ugly is the vessel which you've made." Rabbi Eliezer dismounted his horse and abandoned his destination so that he might follow the man, begging his forgiveness all the while. Rabbi Eliezer followed the traveler all the way to a nearby town. The citizens, seeing this odd sight, came out and implored the traveler to forgive the offense. Rabbi Eliezer, they told him, was a great teacher. Surprised, the traveler said, "If this man is a teacher, may there not be any more like him in Israel." Nevertheless, for the sake of his fellow citizens, the traveler did forgive Rabbi Eliezer on the condition that he never act that way again. So when you leave this talk and you're walking down the street, proud of everything you've learned, the moral of the story is do not, under any circumstances, if you come across a person who greets you, do not call them ugly. But in all seriousness, these kinds of stories of Elijah, they remind people that you never know who you're encountering. It could be the prophet himself. And it's a poignant reminder to treat everyone with equal respect. When we touched on genre earlier, we noted that prophecy contains language that isn't always easy to understand. And I want to conclude this talk by considering, what does prophecy and poetry have in common? And why do the prophets speak in figurative language? Then I'll consider prophecy in relation to its ancient Near Eastern context and ecstatic experience. I think the answer to the question of why do the prophets speak in figurative language has to do with the word ineffable. Can I have the next slide, please? So the Collins Dictionary explains that you use the word ineffable to say something is so great or so extreme that it cannot be described in words. And in a minute, we're going to go through some examples of ineffable experiences. I believe this idea of the ineffable is not only at the heart of understanding what it is that poetry and prophecy tried to do in the Bible, but it's at the very heart of the paradox of human language. Because we use words to communicate, which are representations of the things that we're talking about. They're not the actual thing. And as you would have experienced in your own life, no doubt, there is so much capacity for misunderstanding with verbal communication. And there are some experiences also that we just can't express with words. The great paradox of the Bible then is that it's trying to express divine things, things of God, using language. God obviously can't be contained, and yet we need to use words, which are discrete units, to describe the uncontainable or divine. It might surprise you to find out that poetry is actually one of the most common types of literature in the Bible, or it might not surprise you, considering that poetry is a mode of literature that is so rich in meaning and so ambiguous in many ways. And here we have it as the most common literature in the Bible. I want to pause for a minute and ask you, what experiences in your life would you describe as ineffable? Can we have the next slide, please? So maybe it's the experience of conceiving or birthing a child. In the New Testament, when Mary is visited by the angel Gabriel and she encounters the Holy Spirit through Elizabeth, she then praises God through song, through poetry, right? In Luke 1:26-55. So in Hebrew, the word for poem and song is the same. It's the word shir. So Mary doesn't say in narrative text, I've just found out I'm going to give birth to the Son of God. Isn't that wonderful? She has this beautiful poem and praise song. It's ineffable, her experience. And so she's using figurative language to describe it. Maybe your ineffable experience is the loss of someone you love, which is, it changes us. It cuts us so deep that everything, and it's like a time before that happened and a time after we lost that person. So David, when he mourns the death of Saul and Jonathan in 2 Samuel 1:17-27, he does so using a lament song, which is an incredibly moving piece. That's where we have the famous phrase, "Oh, how the mighty have fallen." Ech naflu hagiborim. Or maybe there are some of you here who are lucky enough to have had a mystical experience or an encounter with the divine or a divine being. And this is the category which I'm interested in looking at now, because many of the prophets obviously see divine entities. They speak to the more than human world. So they speak to the trees, the animals, the rivers, the mountains, and they experience the Spirit of God entering their bodies. And often the words that they use to describe these experiences leave a lot of us quite confused and dumbfounded, and we just don't know what to do with them. Next slide. One way that scholarship has tried to understand these experiences and this language is to say that it's expressing a mystical or ecstatic experience. And biblical scholars in particular stress that we need to understand the prophets of the Bible in the context of prophecy in the ancient Near East when it comes to the Tanakh, and in the context of the Mediterranean prophets when it comes to the New Testament. And Martin Essenen, whose quote I've got up here, he gives a great introduction to the main issues within the scholarly literature on prophecy and ecstasy, if you would like to have a look. And he notes that prophetic performance is typically associated with a specific state of mind, called variously ecstasy, trance, or possession. And what he's trying to say here is that when they're having these experiences, the prophets are not in an ordinary state of consciousness. When you wake up in the morning and you need your coffee, it's a very different way of being in the world to have a mystical experience, a direct encounter with the divine. Many prophets engage in ecstatic behavior in the Bible, and some of these things that they do in these ecstatic states include spirit journeys and seeing heavenly things. Essenen notes that just like in the ancient Near East, presence in the divine council, hardly typical of a regular state of mind, or at least knowledge of its decisions, is required of a true prophet in several biblical texts. So this idea of a divine council is common within the ancient Near East. This is a council of divine beings that give guidance to the person who encounters them. And the prophets engage with these more than human beings. Seeing visions, Essenen says, is one of the basic methods of obtaining a prophetic message. And we're going to go into some of Ezekiel's visions now, which I would not be describing as basic, to be sure. Next slide, please. So I'm going to read these slides and then we'll unpack them a bit and conclude. So this is the opening of Ezekiel. He says, "As I was among the exiles by the Chebar Canal, the heavens were opened and I saw visions of God. As I looked, behold, a stormy wind came out of the north and a great cloud with brightness around it and fire flashing forth continually. And in the midst of the fire, as it were gleaming metal. And from the midst of it came the likeness of 4 living creatures, and this was their appearance. They had a human likeness, but each had 4 faces, and each of them had 4 wings. Their legs were straight, and the soles of their feet were like the sole of a calf's foot, and they sparkled like burnished bronze. Under their wings, on their four sides, they had human hands, and the four had their faces and their wings thus. Their wings touched one another. Then it goes on and on. We're skipping through to chapter 3 now. Then the Spirit lifted me up, and I heard behind me the voice of a great earthquake. Blessed be the glory of the Lord from its place. It was the sound of the wings of the living creatures as they touched one another, and the sound of the wheels beside them, and the sound of a great earthquake. The Spirit lifted me up and took me away, and I went in bitterness in the heat of my spirit, the hand of the Lord being strong upon me. And I came to the exiles at Tel Aviv, who were dwelling by the Chebar Canal, and I sat where they were dwelling. And I sat there stunned among them 7 days. Then the hand of the Lord was upon me there, and he said to me, rise up, go out into the valley, and there I will speak with you. So I rose up and went out into the valley, and the glory of the Lord stood there, the glory that I had seen by the river Chebar, and I fell on my face. The Spirit entered me and set me on my feet, and he spoke with me, and he said to me, go shut yourself inside your house. So in the West, when we think about vision or visionary experience, we tend to think about seeing things. You know, we have this preoccupation with seeing. We've got phrases like seeing is believing and all of that. But I think what's really important about understanding ecstatic experience and vision broadly conceived is that when we're talking about the senses involved in this perception, it's not limited to vision. And this is really clear in Ezekiel's visions. To be sure, Ezekiel sees the heavens open, but he also hears. He's also experiencing non-auditory perception as well. The other thing that Ezekiel is experiencing is strong emotion. He's having a very embodied experience. In verse 14, where it says, I went in bitterness in the heat of my spirit, and the hand of the Lord was strong upon me. You can almost imagine this huge amount of pressure that Ezekiel would have felt as he was being taken to this other place. And then finally, Ezekiel sits by the river, totally overwhelmed for 7 days. And this is often overlooked, but apparently when you have a visitation from the divine, it's not something that you can get over in 30 seconds. It takes some time to integrate. And so Ezekiel here takes 7 days to integrate his prophetic vision, his experience of direct communion with divine beings, God and his messengers. And I don't think that's something to be taken lightly, because it communicates the depths to which Ezekiel was touched by God. And it also communicates how far this experience was from his day-to-day experience, that it totally shifted his state of being to the point that he couldn't even function for 7 days. So this term in Hebrew that's translated in the ESV as stunned in verse 15, it's mashmim in the Hebrew. It's also used to describe settlements that have been totally deserted or become uninhabited, to describe people who have been removed from contact with others. And the same root also forms the word for horror, which is used elsewhere in Ezekiel. So if we take into context the semantic range of this term, or the various meanings that it has throughout the Bible, I don't think it's unreasonable to claim that it's really expressing here that in the aftershock of his encounter with the divine, Ezekiel is experiencing a kind of disembodied or disassociative state. And if we look at the Hebrew of verse 15 in particular, which is on the red here on the screen, it's almost like the language itself, in the very structures of language, the Hebrew is expressing Ezekiel's stuckness and his inability to function. Now, it all sounds very smooth in the English. And I came to the exiles at Tel Aviv, who were dwelling by the Chebar Canal, and I sat where they were dwelling, and I sat there stunned among them 7 days, right? But let me tell you, in the Hebrew, it is virtually incomprehensible. It's stunted and jolted, and there's this repetition in there of the root, which means to sit or to dwell, which has a strong relationship to notions of settlement, of land, and the place in which one lives. And if we think about the context of Ezekiel, which was a book that was written by a refugee, we have in the very first few chapters an emphasis on place and settlement, which is no coincidence, I think. I want to conclude here by reading this verse in the Hebrew so that you can hear the sounds that are being repeated. And I want you to especially take notice of this sh sound, sh. Va'avo el hagola Tel Aviv, hayoshvim el nehar kvar. Va'eshev hema yoshvim sham, va'eshev sham shiv'at yamim, mashmim betucham. Now, this is not something that I would publish in a peer-reviewed journal article, but this repetition of the sh sound, it's almost as though there's this sense of Ezekiel trying to self-soothe. You know, it's the sense of when you have a baby crying and you're trying to soothe it by whispering shh, shh, shh. It's the same feeling that you get when you hear that verse. So that's verse 15. And it's not until God tells Ezekiel to rise up in 3:22 that Ezekiel can even move. So there's this juxtaposition between being pinned down and unable to move and being lifted up by God. Then God appears again and Ezekiel falls on his face in verse 23. Then God lifts him up again onto his feet in 24. So there's this interplay between rising and falling, flying and sitting. It's truly an embodied experience that Ezekiel is having here. And I think it really captures, in an incredibly visceral sense, the ups and downs of exile and the emotional roller coaster that would have ensued once the Babylonians took these elite Judahites out of their city and dragged them into a foreign land. Final slide, please. So we've barely scratched the surface in terms of prophecy in this talk, but I hope I've given you some idea of the prophets in Jewish and Christian tradition. If you're interested in continuing your learning in these traditions, I'm delivering a series of 6-week short courses. So in spring, I'm offering a course called The Women of Paradise, Eve and Lilith Throughout the Ages, which is going to look at Jewish and Christian interpretations of these wives of Adam, and also their role in Jewish and Christian magic in Mesopotamia in late antiquity. And next year, I'm going to offer a course on prophecy, emotion, and ecstasy, which is going to go into greater depth about some of the things we've explored today. And finally, I'm offering another course on the serpent in the Bible and related literature, which is going to trace this fascinating character of the serpent all the way from Eden, all through the Bible, and into rabbinic literature, Christianity, and also Gnosticism, where the serpent is worshipped as the true God, the serpent of Eden, right? So it's fascinating. So if you're interested, please send me an email at info@learnancienthebrew.com. Thanks, everyone.
Natalie, thank you so much for the journey that you've just taken us through. What an amazing journey that we've just been on. And I'm really excited by the courses that you're offering that are coming up. Hopefully you'll have a few people from here who'll join you with that. We've got people who are stunned and inspired. Have you written anything on Amos?
Not yet. I'll let you know when I do.
So we'll go back to that last slide that we had there also, and we have an upcoming event on Sunday, the 23rd of July, 2023, in person at a Jewish venue, which we're not 100% sure of yet. So save the date. Rabbi Fred Morgan and Reverend Dr. Merrill Blair are back again, and this time they're talking prophets. So just invite you to keep that in mind, people. I think I have an interesting sense that one of the things that was really important for me and that enriched the understanding of the prophetic text that you gave us was your use of Midrash and text from Talmud Would you like to say a little bit more about why that might be important for Christians who are reading Jewish texts?
Yeah, I would love to. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about that. So in the Christian tradition, there's the Old Testament, and in the Jewish tradition, there's Tanakh. We know that. But there's also the Oral Torah, which many Jews believe was given to Moses on Sinai at the same time as God gave Tanakh, or gave Torah. So the Midrash and the Talmud are included in this Oral Torah, and it's not something that the rabbis made up. It's divine. It's considered by some Jews to be divine revelation. So it's really important to consider, and it also fills in some of the gaps, many of the gaps that we have in Tanakh. So it's fascinating to consider, and Jesus would have certainly been aware of some of the Midrashim, at least, and the Aramaic translations that have these Midrashim or interpretations in them of Tanakh. So yeah, check out the Talmud and Midrash.
I think that made a lot of sense to me too when you were looking at the prophetess Anna in Luke, and a line that I hadn't actually noticed before, where she gave thanks to God and spoke about the child and all who were looking forward to the redemption of Jerusalem. I'm sure there would be midrashim or things that would circulate about that. We can only imagine what she said and how voice might be given to her through those extra biblical texts.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think, just to bring this to a close, everyone, all of the comments here are really positive. I want to thank you, Natalie, for inviting us into scriptures that we share with the Jewish people, scriptures that we read differently at times and that are arranged differently, but are nonetheless important to us, and that still give life and still give an insight into the world we live, not just the world of the past. And I think that's really important. I thought that the understanding of prophecy you gave us was both expansive and inclusive of multiple perspectives. Your presentation showed great passion and expertise and learning. You invited us into the depth and the polysemous nature of these texts that are capable of holding so much meaning. And you did so in a really visceral way, in a way that was really physical, a way that allowed us to hear those texts, even feel them and imagine them. And I think that's been a real gift for us today, because that has revealed for us new details that were there all along and maybe we never noticed. And I'm sure there are new details yet to be found and yet to be discovered through our studying of these texts and turning them over and turning them over and turning them over. So, Natalie, thank you very much for your presence with us today. We really appreciate it. This video will appear on Zoom sometime next week. Thank you all again for being here.